Point USA since Charlie was killed, just so you guys know this is a fact, has made more than $100 million. That is separate from the $40 million they made at Mar-a-Lago.
I think we're at like over 200,000 for merch sales. Don't quote me on that because I think it just keeps like bumping up like crazy.
What if two people from completely different sides of the same world suddenly came together and started exposing something no one expected? Because right now, the internet is buzzing over a shocking twist involving Candace Owens, and someone even closer to the center of it all, connected directly to Charlie Kirk. At first, it didn't make sense. Why would they team up? What could they possibly have in common? But then something changed. Claims started surfacing, internal details, behind-the-scenes tension, and suddenly, what looked like a random alliance started feeling like a calculated move. But here's the problem. If even part of this is true, it could shake everything people thought they knew about TPUSA. To understand why this situation is blowing up, you have to look at the players involved. And Candace Owens has built a reputation on being outspoken, direct, and unafraid to challenge people, even those on her own side. She doesn't just comment on issues, she confronts them. And that's exactly why when her name gets attached to something controversial, people pay attention immediately. Then there's Charlie Kirk, the face behind Turning Point USA, often called TPUSA. Over the years, TPUSA has grown into a major force, especially among young conservatives. Big events, big audiences, a strong, unified message. On the outside, everything looks organized, polished, and tightly controlled. But then, something changed. A new name entered the conversation. Not a public figure in the same way, not someone constantly in the spotlight, but someone with a direct connection, Charlie Kirk's sister. And this is where it gets strange, because instead of staying out of the public eye, she started speaking. Not loudly at first, just small hints, subtle comments, enough to raise questions, but not enough to give clear answers. And then, those hints started aligning with what Candace was saying. Same themes, same concerns, same direction. But here's the problem. None of it was fully explained. No detailed breakdown, no full story, just fragments. And that's exactly what made people start digging. Because when two voices, especially ones this close to the situation, start pointing in the same direction without saying everything, it usually means there's more beneath the surface. And once people realized that, the attention shifted fast. Because now, it wasn't just speculation. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. Well, it didn't start with a big announcement, no press release, no official statement, just a short clip that began circulating online. In it, Candace Owens is speaking casually, but there's a shift in her tone, subtle but noticeable. She's not just commenting on general issues anymore, she's hinting at something internal, something specific. At first, people weren't sure what she meant, but then something changed. She referenced people inside organizations who aren't what they claim to be. No names, no direct accusations, but the wording, sharp, intentional, and for those paying attention, it felt targeted. And this is where it gets strange. Within hours, a separate account, linked to someone identified as Charlie Kirk's sister, posted a message that echoed the same idea, different words, same direction. Talking about truth eventually coming out, talking about not staying silent anymore. Two voices, same timing, same energy, and suddenly it didn't feel random. Because when Charlie Kirk is involved, even indirectly, people listen closely. Not just because of him, but because of what he represents through Turning Point USA, a brand built on consistency, alignment, strong messaging. But here's the problem. When cracks start appearing inside something built on unity, they stand out. And it doesn't stop there. People began digging into older clips of Candace, interviews, speeches, even casual live streams. And weirdly, they started finding moments that now felt different. Comments that once sounded general now seemed like they were hinting at something deeper, almost like she had been building toward this. But the biggest shift came next. Someone uncovered a clip where Candace pauses mid-sentence, just for a second, but enough to feel like she almost said something, and then stopped herself. At the time, no one thought much of it. Now, it felt loaded. Because now people weren't just asking what she was saying. They were asking what she wasn't saying. And that question spread fast. Because if she knew something before, why wait until now? What changed? That's when things started falling apart. More posts began surfacing from Charlie Kirk's sister. Still not fully detailed, but more direct, referencing internal issues, talking about how things are run behind closed doors. And each post added a little more pressure. Not enough to confirm anything, but enough to make people uncomfortable. And that discomfort, it drove attention. Because now, the conversation wasn't just about Candace. It wasn't just about one person speaking out. It was about the possibility of something happening inside TPUSA that hadn't been seen publicly. And this is where the tension really started building. Because as more people watched, more questions came up. Why now? Why together? And why wasn't anyone from inside responding? Because up to this point, there was silence. No pushback, no denial, no clarification. And in situations like this, silence doesn't calm things down. It makes everything louder. And just when it seemed like things might slow down, another clip dropped. And this one, it pushed everything into a completely different direction. The next clip didn't come from a polished interview or a public event. It came from a smaller setting, less formal, more raw. And that's exactly why it hit harder. In this clip, Candace Owens isn't holding back the same way she was before. She's still not naming names. But the tone has shifted. There's frustration now, directness, like she's getting closer to saying something she's been holding in for a while. And then she says it. Not everything, but enough. She mentions internal pressure. That phrase alone, it changed everything. Because now this wasn't just about disagreement or opinion. It hinted at something structural, something happening behind the scenes inside organizations like Turning Point USA. And this is where it gets strange. Almost immediately after that clip started circulating, Charlie Kirk's sister posted again. This time, not vague, not subtle. She talked about decisions being made that people don't agree with. And more importantly, she said, "It's not what people think it is." That line spread fast because it suggested one thing very clearly. The public image might not match the internal reality, but here's the problem. Still no specifics. No clear explanation of what those decisions were, no direct examples, just tension. And that tension, it pulled people in even more. Because now, everyone was trying to connect the dots. And it doesn't stop there. People started revisiting past events linked to Charlie Kirk and TPUSA. Big conferences, public appearances, moments where everything seemed smooth. But now, they were looking for cracks. Moments where something felt off. And weirdly, they started finding them. Clips where interactions felt slightly tense. Moments where responses seemed rehearsed. Even small pauses that now felt more meaningful. Individually, nothing major. But together, it started forming a pattern. And that's when things started falling apart even faster. Because now, it wasn't just about what Candace and Charlie's sister were saying. It was about what people thought they were uncovering. And then, a new angle appeared. An anonymous account claimed they had direct knowledge of internal meetings. No proof, no identity, but the claims? Detailed. They described disagreements, internal debates, even moments where certain ideas were pushed, while others were shut down. And suddenly, the story expanded, because if those claims were even partially true, then this wasn't just a personal issue, it was organizational. And this is where the stakes got higher. Because once an organization's internal dynamics become part of public conversation, everything changes. Reputation, trust, credibility, all of it comes into question. And still, no official response. Not from Charlie, not from TPUSA. Nothing. And at this point, that silence didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt heavy, like something was being held back. But waiting for what? That's the question no one could answer. Because while the public was trying to piece things together, there was a growing sense that something bigger hadn't been revealed yet. Like everything so far was just fragments, pieces of a larger story that hadn't fully surfaced. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any higher, another drop hit. And this one, it didn't just add to the story, it changed how people saw everything that came before. No, the next development didn't come from a clip. It came from a pattern, and once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. Because now, everything that Candace Owens had been saying, and everything Charlie Kirk's sister had been hinting at, started lining up in a way that felt too precise to ignore. And this is where it gets strange. Someone compiled a timeline. Not just random posts, but specific moments. Candace's statements, the sisters' comments, internal events tied to Turning Point USA, all placed side by side. And suddenly, a sequence appeared. Moments where Candace spoke, followed by reactions. Moments where the sister posted, followed by silence. Moments where both seemed to escalate at the same time. It didn't look random anymore. It looked coordinated. But here's the problem. No one could prove coordination, at least not directly. Because everything was still indirect. Hints, timing, patterns, nothing concrete enough to confirm, but enough to raise serious questions. And it doesn't stop there. People began noticing that every time the conversation started to cool down, something new would appear. A new post, a new clip, a new hint, almost like the story was being kept alive on purpose. And that raised an even bigger question. Was this exposure, or was it strategy? Because if it was exposure, why not just say everything at once? Why stretch it out? Why release information piece by piece? That's when things started shifting again. A short audio clip surfaced, unverified, but widely shared. In it, a voice, claimed to be connected to internal discussions, talks about managing messaging and keeping things aligned publicly. Nothing explosive on its own. But in the context of everything else, it hit differently. Because now, the idea of control wasn't just speculation, it felt real. And suddenly, Candace's earlier comments about internal pressure started making more sense. But here's where things took a sharper turn. Charlie Kirk's sister posted again. This time, more direct than ever. She said, "People think it's about politics. It's not. It's about how things are actually run." That line changed everything. Because now, the focus shifted. Away from ideology, toward structure, toward leadership, toward decisions being made behind the scenes. And that's when things started falling apart in a bigger way, because once the conversation moves from public messaging to internal operations, the stakes rise fast. Now, people weren't just questioning statements, they were questioning systems. How decisions were made, who had influence, what was being controlled, and why. And right in the middle of all that, Charlie Kirk still hadn't said anything. No response, no clarification, nothing. And that silence, at this stage, it felt louder than anything else. Because when multiple voices are pointing in the same direction, and the center of it stays quiet, people start assuming there's a reason. And that assumption, it builds pressure. And just when it seemed like everything was about to boil over, it did. Because now, it wasn't just posts and clips anymore. People from inside started reacting. And that's when the situation truly escalated. And that's when the situation stopped being speculation and started feeling like something real was breaking through. Because up until now, it was patterns, clips, and carefully worded hints. But then, people closer to the situation began reacting in ways that were impossible to ignore. It started quietly. A few individuals who had previously worked with Turning Point USA began making subtle moves. Old photos with Charlie Kirk? Gone. Event highlights? Deleted. Mentions scrubbed from profiles. No announcements, no explanations. But those moves? They spoke loudly. And this is where it gets strange. Some of these people weren't even directly involved in the conversation. They hadn't posted anything about Candace Owens. They hadn't addressed the situation publicly at all. But they were distancing themselves. Why? That question hit hard. Because when people step back without saying why, it usually means they know something they're not ready to say. And it doesn't stop there. When a former event staffer, someone who had been involved behind the scenes, posted a thread. Not emotional, not dramatic, just detailed. They talked about pressure, about expectations, about how certain conversations were handled internally. Again, Nothing explosive on its own. But combined with everything else, it added weight. Because now, it wasn't just voices on the outside, it was someone from inside, describing an environment that didn't fully match the public image. And that's when things started falling apart even faster. Because more voices followed, not full statements, just small confirmations, replies, subtle agreements, people saying things like, "This isn't surprising," or "There's more to it." And suddenly, the narrative shifted again. Because now, it wasn't about whether something was happening. It was about how much of it was real. And this is where the tension hit a new level. Because the longer this went on, the more it felt like a tipping point, like something bigger was about to come out. And then, it did. A clip resurfaced. Old. Months old. But now, it meant something completely different. In it, Candace Owens is speaking. Calm, controlled. But there's a moment where she says, "At some point, truth has to matter more than alignment." At the time, it sounded like a general statement. Now, it felt targeted, like a message that had been there all along, just waiting to be understood. And right after that clip started trending again, Charlie Kirk's sister posted one more time. Short, direct. People are finally starting to see it. That's it. No explanation, but it hit harder than anything before. Because now, it didn't feel like hints anymore. It felt like confirmation. And that's when everything reached its peak. Because now the pressure wasn't just online, it was public, visible, growing, and still. No response from Charlie. No official statement from TPUSA. Nothing to push back. Nothing to clarify. And at this point, that silence didn't just feel intentional. It felt risky. Because when a story builds this much momentum and no one steps in to control it, it starts controlling itself. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to stop. But then, the biggest twist hit. Not a clip, not a post. Something much bigger. A piece of information that didn't just add to the story, it changed how everything was understood. And if it's true, then what people thought this was about might only be part of the truth. And then, the piece that changed everything finally surfaced. Not a clip, not a vague post, something more concrete, an internal memo. Not officially released, but portions of it started circulating fast. Screenshots, transcriptions, enough that people could start piecing together what it said. And what it revealed shifted the entire story. Because this wasn't just about tension or disagreement anymore. It was about structure. Inside Turning Point USA, the memo outlined something people hadn't fully understood before, how messaging was handled internally. Not just what was said publicly, but how it was shaped before it ever reached an audience. And this is where it gets strange. There were references to alignment protocols, guidelines for how public figures associated with the organization should present certain topics. Not scripts, but close enough to feel controlled. Suggested angles, preferred framing, even notes about avoiding certain discussions altogether. On the surface, that might sound normal for a large organization, but here's the problem. The memo also referenced internal pushback, concerns raised by individuals who didn't fully agree with how things were being handled. And suddenly, everything started connecting. Candace's comments about internal pressure, the sisters' posts about how things are actually run. Those weren't random, they were pointing to this. And it doesn't stop there. One section stood out more than anything else. It mentioned managing divergence. In simple terms, handling people who didn't fully align. And that's where things shifted. Because now, the story wasn't just about exposure. No, it was about control versus independence. About what happens when someone inside a system starts questioning how that system operates. And that's the reveal. Not that something exploded overnight, but that tension had been building internally for a long time, quietly, behind the scenes, until it couldn't stay contained anymore. And when it finally started surfacing, it didn't come out clean. It came out in fragments, in hints, in voices speaking just enough to be heard, but not enough to fully close the loop. And that's why this feels so big, because if even part of this memo is accurate, then what people have been seeing publicly might only be part of the story. When you step back and look at everything together, the clips, the timing, the voices lining up, onto now this internal memo, the story stops being about just Candace Owens or Charlie Kirk. It becomes about something bigger: control versus independence. Because what this situation really highlights is how messaging inside large organizations like Turning Point USA isn't always as simple as it looks from the outside. There's structure, there's coordination, and sometimes there's pressure. But here's the deeper part. The moment someone inside that structure starts questioning it, everything changes. Because now it's not just about what's being said publicly, it's about what's happening behind the scenes. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Candace didn't come out with a full breakdown. Charlie's sister didn't drop everything at once. Instead, it came out in fragments. And that matters, because fragments create curiosity. They keep people watching. They keep the story alive. But they also reveal something else. That whatever is happening isn't simple. It's layered. It's complicated. And it's still unfolding. Because if this was just a misunderstanding, it would have been cleared up by now. But it wasn't. And that's what makes this situation so uncomfortable. Because when clarity doesn't come, people start asking harder questions. And sometimes, those questions lead to answers no one expected. So now we're left with a situation that feels bigger than just a few clips or posts. Is this a real internal breakdown, or just the surface of something much deeper inside TPUSA? Because if voices this close to the center are speaking, even in fragments, then something clearly shifted. But the biggest question is still unanswered. What haven't we heard yet? Because if this is only part of the story, then what comes next could change everything. What do you think? Is this exposure or just controlled damage unfolding in real time? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want more breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe. Because some stories don't end when the conversation starts. They're just getting started.